Hello, hello.
Hi, hello there.
Hi, Talon. Welcome aboard the stream train.
Oh, it's good to be here. I
uh,
love that. I love the charity streams.
yes, yeah. It's been pretty crazy so far. Our metabolisms are about going to rustic from all the peppers we've eaten. But other than that, we have surpassed already our entire goal, so we're excited about that.
Oh, nice.
And we're ready to just keep on racing as we still have 4 hours. Are you ready to take over the stream for a second?
Oh yeah, dude, I was born ready.
Awesome, great. Ladies and gentlemen, Talon Stradley from Newton's Dark Room, and I'm going to duck out for a bit. Good
All
luck,
right,
Stradley.
hello there, guys. So, all right. So I wanted to give some context. So I write a lot of different stuff. You can find a lot of my writing at Newton's Dark Room. But some things never see the light of day. I spend all this time, I write this script, and then it just kind of never appears anywhere. So I have this file on my computer called the Maternity Ward, and it's all of the scripts that have not been anything yet. Like they're script, they're done, but they haven't been produced, they haven't been edited, they haven't quite found their home. So I'm going to read you at least one of the stories, possibly two of the scripts from my maternity ward. So I hope you guys enjoy it. And yeah, this might be the only time that it is ever performed. We'll see. So without further ado, Elizabeth Hurley. Friends of history, champions of science, purveyors of progress, we welcome you to yet another episode of Ahead of Your Time. Today, we will be looking at the one of the most important and influential expeditions to come out of the turn of the century. This, of course, can be none other than Elizabeth Hurley's fabled lunar expedition of 1901. This once in a lifetime trek marks the only time a human being has set foot on the moon, making it absolutely crucial to our understanding of outer space. While many recognize her name and are aware of the landmark discoveries she has made, very few know any details about the expedition itself. Today, we hope to change that. It's an exciting story with harrowing mountains, cold winter storms, and interspatial collisions. So now, without further ado, the story of Elizabeth Hurley's lunar trek. It all started in the winter of 1897. Elizabeth Hurley had been studying the moon for several years when she stumbled upon something. The moon was getting closer. This, in and of itself, was not all that impressive. Scientists have known this for years. Hurley, however, took it a step further. You see, it had been theorized that the moon would get so close that it would enter the Earth's atmosphere. This only happened once every 100 years or so, and Hurley knew that it would be happening soon. Now, at the time, the tallest mountain was Mount Sim, a looming jagged beast in northern Russia. This mountain rose so high that its peak was just beneath the end of our atmosphere. Very few treks made it to the top, and only one ever made it back. Elizabeth Hurley knew she had to climb this mountain. Hurley had been tracking the moon's orbit relative to the Earth. Not only was the moon going to be at its closest in 1901, but it was going to pass just over the peak of Mount Sim. All Hurley had to do was to find a way to latch on, and she would be the first ever human being on the moon. Well, that wasn't all Hurley needed to do. Climbing the most infamous mountain on the face of the planet wouldn't be easy. She would need a crew, equipment, and a benefactor to fund it all. This is where Elizabeth Hurley fell flat. A scientist and adventurer, she hated the stuffy politeness of the upper class. It was up to her. If it was up to her, she would never wear a suit again. But it wasn't up to her, and she needed to excite the money out of whatever poor sap would let her. She would start with the more sensational aspects of her work. Did you know that it's possible to set foot on the moon? This was and still is an intriguing statement and a fantastic. Nobody walks away from a conversation about lunar travel. The moment she went into the details, however, the entire conversation would stop. But that's impossible. The only expedition to safely return from Mount Sim was the third body retrieval unit. Hurley had spoken with every person at the dinner that night, and not one person would consider throwing away money on a pipe dream. That's when Milton Massett walked into the room. He was late, as usual. His overcoat was unbuttoned, and his tie was twisted into some unnameable knot. When Hurley looked over, he was picking his dropped bowler hat from off the ground. Hesitant, Hurley approached him. Fascinating. I will fund your journey, but only on the condition that I will join you to the moon. Hurley was less than pleased at this condition. Believe it or not, she actually turned Massett down. It wasn't until a couple months later, after numerous other galas across the state, that Hurley finally tracked down Massett and accepted his offer. Now that she had the funding, Hurley could begin preparations. She started right away with one of the more pressing issues. She did not know how close the moon would get to the Earth. It could be too far to reach with just the human body. It could be so close that it scrapes the peak itself. It could be just perfect. She hoped that would be the case, but she also knew that it would not, so she began to devise a plan. Hurley theorized that it would be Hurley theorized that it would be possible to build a freestanding A-frame support structure that could support and elevate a human person. She called this hypothetical structure the Lateral Ascension Discovery Depot for Explanatory Research, or LADDER. She knew that this would be the hardest yet most essential piece of equipment. Most of the next 2 years was spent developing and perfecting the ladder. Her next step was assembling a crew. Hurley figured she needed a 5-member team: a Sherpa familiar with the mountain, someone to manage and operate scientific equipment, 2 members to stabilize the ladder, one for each leg, and finally, a Milton Massett caretaker. As hard as it was to find a benefactor, it was incredibly easy to find her crew. It would seem that the rich are more partial to their money than scientists are to their lives. Regardless, she had her crew. First was Sofia Martinez, an up and coming scientist from Southern California. She would be in charge of the mobile lab, its equipment, as well as conducting the research once they got to the moon. Next was Roberst, the Sherpa, a local at the base of Mount Sim. He hiked deep into the terrain every Monday morning in order to harvest the rare berries he grew there. He was the sole proprietor of Roberst's Peak Berry Jams and Preserves. Finally, there was Todd and Rodney, 2 drunks dumb enough to volunteer after a night of drinking. You see, the latter required 2 people to operate. These people would have to stay behind. Nobody was willing to make the dangerous trek up to the mountain just to sit at the peak. Nobody except the fogged minds of Todd and Rodney. With their crew assembled, Hurley was ready to fly across the Atlantic Ocean to the Siberian wilderness. Milton Massett met the team at the airport along with his designated caretaker, Neville. Neville was a long and round man with a friendly face that only smiled for Massett. When Hurley opposed the needless addition to the group, Massett threatened to pull funding and cancel the plane. Hesitant, Hurley accepted Massett's demands. They met Roberst at a small airport about a day's journey from his house at the base of Mount Sim. There was no train there, so the crew would have to walk. Although the walk was flat and easy, Massett was already finding things to complain about. "Dreadfully dull, isn't it?" Hurley assured him that that would not always be the case. They spent the night at Robert's cabin, and in the morning they had a breakfast of toasted bread and peakberry jam. After that, the crew began the dangerous hike up the deadliest peak. The progress was slower than expected. Hurley, Robert, and Sophia were fine, despite their heavy loads. Todd and Rodney carried behind, each carrying the end of the lengthy and awkward ladder. Hurley knew that this would be a challenging load and even the most experienced mountaineer, let alone a couple of town drunks. Neville and Milton Massett trailed behind at the very end of the pack. They carried little. Massett only had a walking cane, and Neville carried water for the 2 of them. Hurley was impressed by the high spirit of Massett, who spoke excitedly about the real journey beginning. As they ascended the mountain, the wind picked up. Very few would brave the mountain. No one ever had attempted to peak it during the cold winter months. Unfortunately, Mount Sim was simply a means to an end for Hurley. She didn't have any choice on time or location. If she wanted to reach the moon, she would have to make it to the peak before the moon was at its closest. They had 4 months. At the time, this seemed like plenty of time. They would likely get back to the peak early, allowing them to prepare. After their first day of hiking, however, Hurley realized that it would be a miracle to make it there on time. 2 weeks had passed. The journey upwards was slow and inconsistent. Sophia had all of her lab equipment: beakers and bottles, an early microscope, various different chemicals, and an old-timey thermometer, the kind you would wear on your back. Robert carried most of the supplies: food, water, tents, and the like. Hurley carried additional supplements as well as some administrative gear, a calendar, a map, and a portable grandfather clock. All of this kept the 3 from helping the less robust members. Todd and Rodney were impossible to motivate. Occasionally, Hurley would look back to see the 2 stopped and huddled for warmth, ladder on the ground. At one point, the 2 were walking backwards up the mountain. When asked why, they said that they didn't like the wind in their face. Bassett was in a much better mood despite his high maintenance and lack of physical contribution. He seemed to genuinely enjoy the adventure. It would make Hurley laugh to look back and see this padded orb of bundled clothes waddling up the sheer face of the world's most treacherous terrain, all the while whistling. He and Neville would play word games on the ascent. Sometimes Sophia would join, often whining. Overall, the group was in good spirits and on the move. Hurley found it difficult to find too much joy in company. The portable grandfather clock, strapped to the outside of her backpack, pulsed a steady ticking, reminding her of her approaching deadline. 3 months in, only 1 month until the group must be at the peak. Robert estimates that they are at least a month and a half out. If they want to make it, they will have to make some fundamental changes to their traveling arrangement. They have this discussion around a fire. Todd and Rodney are huddled for warmth. Massett is playing a harmonica of all things. The cold weather gives the reedy instrument a hoarse sound. In between songs, Massett gives great details on the composers of the pieces and the stories they tell. Hurley wonders out loud whether classical music was meant to be played on a harmonica. The group took stock of all their gear. The goal was to find anything that could be left behind in order to speed their ascent. It was determined the latter, their biggest challenge, would have to stay with the group. Without it, their entire trip would be wasted. The same was said for the lab equipment. In the end, they left most of the administrative gear that Hurley carried. The group would keep track of days and estimated times on a single sheet of paper. She hoped this would allow them to reach the peak on time. Everyone also agreed to leave half of their rations. With these things left behind, Hurley and Robert were able to assist more with the transportation of the latter, hopefully getting them back on track. Massett kept his harmonica, opting instead to leave his granola bar. With a pile of metal, papers, and food buried halfway in the snow, the expedition hurriedly continued. 3 days. That's how long they had. According to Hurley's estimations, the peak was within view, but only in the distance. They easily had 3 days left of travel, most definitely more. This was when Hurley implemented the running protocol, a plan where everyone ran instead of walked. The plan worked great for the more fit members, Hurley, Sophia, and Robert. Todd, Rodney, Massett, and Neville weren't as successful. Hurley and Robert took the ladder and ran with Sophia, leaving the rest on the snowy trail. They were going to get to the moon. The last day was coming to an end. It was sunset already. Hurley, Sophia, and Robert were beginning the final and steepest part of their ascent. They were all hungry. The food had been left behind with Todd and Rodney. As Robert began the free climb to set the rope for the scientists, the moon appeared. It was massive and growing bigger. Our hulking sibling in the sky was approaching. It blocked all of the stars. Its gravitational pull made everyone feel lighter. Luckily, this assisted with the climbing. Robert was the sixth and final person to stand atop the peak of Mount Sim. As he tied the climbing rope to a sturdy rock, Sophia called out. The moon was approaching, sure, but it was coming much closer than Hurley had predicted. The moon pressed itself against the side of the peak, which scraped a new ditch into the moon before it cracked and burst. Robert was thrown off the peak, landing in a snowdrift. Several boulders followed suit. The moon was passing just above Hurley's head. She could almost reach up and touch it. She could hear Sophia shouting something. When Hurley looked down, Sophia was holding a wobbly but standing ladder. Hurley nodded and quickly clambered up the rungs. Once she got to the top, the moon's gravity took hold and she fell from the top of the ladder to the lunar surface above. Elizabeth Hurley was the first human being to ever set foot on the moon. Hurley heard shouting once again. She looked above her to see Sophia with arms full of lab equipment. The ground of the moon was shaking, the roaring of the scraping making it impossible to make out Sophia's words. Sophia then proceeded to shot put pieces of scientific gear towards the moon above her. Some of it came crashing back down to Earth. Others got pulled up by the moon and slingshotted towards our atmosphere. A few pieces landed on the lunar surface, inches away from Hurley. It was then that Hurley noticed Sophia was getting smaller. The moon was moving away, continuing its elliptical orbit. Hurley knew that her time was limited. Currently, the moon was inside of the Earth's atmosphere. The air was thin, but it was there. Hurley knew that as the moon moved away, the oxygen levels would only decrease. What's more, the Earth's gravitational pull would be weakened. The further she got, the harder it would be to return back home. Hurley took inventory of her gear. A mason jar, this was before test tubes were invented, the old-timey backpack thermometer, and her saving grace, a radio. The first thing she did was try the radio. She was relieved to hear Robert's answer. He was battered and short of breath, but the burly mountaineer was still kicking. Hurley explained the situation. Robert, I think I have a plan. Do you remember the weather balloon? Well, if we... Static. Robert was cut off. As the moon pulled away and the moon slowly rotated, the signal had been lost. Hurley grabbed the mason jar, strapped on the thermometer, and began running to find a signal. Hello? Hello, Elizabeth, are you there? Yes. Good, okay. The weather balloon, if we release it, it will float up towards the moon. As it enters the moon's atmosphere, it will begin to float back up, but this time towards the Earth. It will be a tight window, but if you can make it to the balloon in time, you may be able to make it back. I'll release it towards the edge facing the North Star. He cut out once more. For good this time. Hurley was not able to respond. All that she had heard was a half-baked plan and the broad side of the moon. The plan might not have been the best, but it was what she had. She ran towards the North Star. The point of this expedition wasn't just to reach the moon. They wanted to learn something. Most of the gear had been left behind, but with the gear that she had, Hurley could check one thing. It may seem small, but this data paved the way for lunar theoretics. She scooped dirt with the mason jar, booted up the thermometer, and took the temperature of the dirt. Thanks to the jar and the backpack thermometer, Hurley was able to take these measurements on the move. She bounded in the low gravity, leaping over craters to reach the rendezvous point. On the ground, Robert carefully lined up the inflating weather balloon and released it. It began its slow descent. Hurley looked up. In the distance, she could see the balloon approaching. She picked up speed, moving further and further with each jump. She was making good speed, but she didn't think she could make it. The thermometer dinged. She turned her head to look at its reading. 73.4 degrees. Exactly room temperature. 73.4. 73.4. Hurley drilled the number into her brain and dropped the thermometer and jar. The loss of weight allowed her to move much faster, which she would need. The balloon had stopped, which means it was moments away from floating back towards the Earth. Hurley pushed against the craters with every ounce of strength, propelling herself towards her ride home. It had already begun to float away, its string dangling beneath it. She was one jump away. She planted both her feet on the ground, crouched down low, and pushed away the moon. She launched towards the sky, arms outstretched above her head. She felt a small tickle on her fingertips. The string. It was just out of reach. She felt the gentle tug of moon's gravity. Acting instinctively, she began to spin her finger in the string. She was able to wrap the tip of her middle finger just enough that the balloon softly snapped Hurley from lunar gravity. She found a better grip on the string and slowly floated between the Earth and the moon. The balloon carried her for a bit, until the Earth's gravity took charge once again. Hurley began plummeting towards the Earth, the balloon trying in vain to slow her. She crashed into a pile of snow littered with debris of the collision. She heard the balloon pop, but she was back. Sophia and Robert rushed to Hurley. 73.4, 73.4, 73.4. The two helped their leader to her feet. Sophia wrapped her in an unzipped sleeping bag. The world was quiet now. There was no wind. The moon was slowly retreating, still blocking the sky, still beautiful. The three began walking down the mountain, leaving the ladder and their littered gear just off the former peak. Todd, Rodney, and Neville were crying. On the ground with a bloodied head was Massett. He was dead. Through tears, Neville said that the man died with a smile on his face. He got to see more than ever even the world had to offer. The group brought the body further down the mountain. They intended to bury him in his hometown, but after the body began to decay, they realized that this would not be possible. They buried him in a pile of calendars, maps, and a portable grandfather clock. The rest of the group returned. safe. They were hungry, they were tired, they were battered, but they had done it. They feasted on peak berries at Robert's cabin. Todd and Rodney would go on to return home. They did not continue the expeditious lifestyle, but they did have the best story of any of the town drunks. They would have many free drinks for years to come. Neville maintained the Masset Manor, eventually opening it up as a museum to the public. Robert stayed at his cabin and continued his peakberry jam and preservatives business. Sales picked up drastically upon the publication of their journey. Sophia Martinez would become a renowned field scientist. She was among the first to perform studies in the Arctic, Sahara Desert, and pioneered deep-sea research. And finally, Elizabeth Hurley. She would go on to publish her article regarding lunar dirt temperature to much acclaim. She earned the title the Mother of Lunar Theoretics. She spent the rest of her career overseeing further lunar research at the esteemed American Celestial Science Center. And that is the story of Elizabeth Hurley.
Very nicely done. Very nicely told. Well,
Look at that time.
Look at that timing. I know, it was incredible. I was actually kind of waiting to see, maybe he'll have a stopping point soon. So then, sure enough, there it came. Greetings, guys. Pat is back. Thank you so much to Talon Stradley from Newton's Dark Room for covering the stream for us while we set up the next event, which is Left 4 Dead 2.